Today, we are hosting Tristan McCohen, who is going to speak with us about the impact of universities on climate change. In the announcement, we share the link to a working paper that Tristan and his colleagues published recently. I'll make sure to have that in the chat box as well, so please check it out. Let me introduce Tristan quickly and then move to his presentation. Tristan is a professor of international education at the Institute of Education, University College London. His work focuses on higher education and international development, particularly in Latin America and sub-Saharan Africa. Among other issues, he's looking at access, quality, innovation, and impact. His latest book is Higher Education for and Beyond the Sustainable Development Goals, Palgrave. We will provide a link to that book as well. And he's the editor of Compare, a journal of international comparative education. He's the principal investigator for the Transforming Universities for a Changing Climate Research project. And this paper or presentation he's going to give us today is part of this project. Tristan is going to speak for 20 minutes. After that, we'll have ample time to have Q&A, discussion, etc. I'm inviting people to use the link I'm going to provide to a Google Doc where you can write comments and ideas for others to see. This is something that we can share with you later on, and that will be some kind of notes-taking, collective notes-taking from the event of today. So without further ado, Tristan, welcome to our webinar, and I'll let you share your screen and take it from here.
Great, thank you very much, Oren, and thank you for the invitation. It's really great to engage with the Center for Sustainable Futures. As we heard, the Center looks at education in its broadest meaning, formal, non-formal. I'm going to look specifically at one level of education and part of the formal sector, but hopefully some of the things we'll talk about today are relevant to the broader range of education experiences. But it's important to recognize that universities have some quite distinctive features, and even in relation to schools. And that's what I'll try to draw out today in posing the question of how do we understand the role and impact of universities on climate change, and to try and think of it in a fresh way that can both help us reorient the work of universities, so that there is a normative dimension to this, but also perhaps recognize some of the things that universities are already doing, but don't always are not always recognized, and both in high-income countries and in lower income and middle-income countries as well. So the paper that I'm going to present is part of, as Oren said, part of a larger research project, which is focusing on universities and climate change in Brazil, Kenya, Mozambique, and Fiji. So it's a large empirical project, in fact, where we're looking at the role of universities in participatory action research groups within those universities in fostering local innovations to address climate change in all its different, both the mitigation and adaptation sides of it. So it's an empirical project, but this is a theoretical paper that came out of the initial phase of that, where we're trying to understand how to frame the different actions that universities engage in. So that's something of the backdrop of the paper. The work that is currently being published in relation to higher education and climate change clusters, and that there has been an increasing amount of literature on this. It clusters largely around curriculum and embedding the content around, and to some extent skills and competencies around climate change in the curriculum of universities. So that's one sphere of the literature, and the other sphere is around campus sustainability, greening the campus. And literature on both of those, particularly the latter, has grown quite a lot in recent years. But one of the things that I want to do in this paper is to try and join up those different aspects and have a more of a holistic view of the role of universities. but also to highlight some of the areas that aren't quite so recognized beyond the conventional teaching and research functions of universities, and particularly to contest the idea of universities in the sense of a kind of star institution saving the world. And this is something that we're also grappling with in the context of COVID. And there have been some heroic work carried out by different universities in relation to COVID. And I'm not for a moment questioning the public good role that certain research-intensive universities have, even on a global level. But what I'm going to argue is that's not sufficient. We can't think of a global higher education system with a few universities located in the global north that are going to solve all the problems around the world. It's simply not going to happen because of the nature of the challenges that we're facing. And the nature of higher education. So what I'll argue is that the implications a lot of this work is that we need high quality higher education in every context in the world. So I'll start by looking very briefly at the nature of climate change, only in the briefest possible way as a way of framing the discussions on the role of the university. So highlighting 5 aspects of this very distinctive global challenge. And I won't be able to go through the facts of climate change, and I'm sure you're all very well aware of the critical threat that's posed to the globe through emissions of greenhouse gases and their cumulative effects. So first point, it's a complex issue, and I mean that in the general sense, but also in the technical sense of complex systems. So it's not a linear problem that can have a very easy intervention that interrupts the cause and effect and provides a solution. So it's a very complex system that has feedback loops that can cause positive or negative feedback, that has elements of emergence, characteristics which are quite hard to predict. And the nature of that complexity means that it needs to be studied constantly and in great depth from many different angles. It's also contested, the most obvious contestation being the fact that there are people that deny the existence of climate change, full stop, or of course there are lots of shades of denial as well. Some people accept that there's climate change but deny that it's anthropogenic or deny its implication, so there are many different shades, but there's a significant amount of contestation. And even amongst those people who consider that it's a serious issue, there's also significant disagreement on the kind of solution that will best fit, whether we move towards more technical ones, geoengineering, for example, or more human, cultural-based solutions, political, economic ones, and so forth. Climate change is anthropogenic. It's caused by human beings in interaction with the non-human environment. And the relevance of that, of course, is that universities need to address the topic in all of its different dimensions, not only in terms of natural science, engineering and so forth, but also in social sciences, humanities, because of course, climate change is rooted in a model of civilization in political, economic and cultural spheres. It's also a global issue. So this links in with the comments I was making earlier. Obviously, changes in climate do not respect national boundaries, although there are national elements, of course, that relate to legislation, political processes, economies, and there is, of course, a climate justice, questions of the disproportionate impact of climate negative climate effects on the poorest communities in the world who generally contribute less to the problem. So there is that question of injustices. And the final point, that it's time bound. It's extremely urgent because we don't only have to reach certain targets by particular dates, but the later we leave it to create action, the more the accumulation of the greenhouse gases is going to create tipping points beyond which we can't return. So given those characteristics, universities are absolutely essential in addressing climate change because of those very complex issues, but also they need to, in some cases, change their ways of working, or certainly engage many different aspects of their working that they might not have done normally. And an obvious aspect of that is thinking about climate change not only in environmental science classes or climatology research, but across the whole range of different disciplines. Only 10% of a recent study showed that only 10% of funding for climate change research goes to social sciences, arts and humanities. So that's an indication of the disparities there. So I'll now show something of this frame which is one way of understanding the ways in which universities play a role in impacting climate change. Instead of the conventional 3 pillars of the university, I've broken this out into 5, which I think highlights the different functions more clearly for the purposes of this particular work. So normally we think of universities in terms of teaching, research, and service or community engagement in the third pillar. So those first 2, teaching and research, I've kept more or less as we normally think of them, education and knowledge production, but knowledge production there including not only basic research, but also various forms of applied research and technological innovation. And education, importantly, we're thinking that both of specific professional education that might relate to jobs that have some kind of direct bearing on the environment or climate change, but also the general civic and personal learning that are acquired by individuals who go through university, whatever their study. I think there has been attention to this in the literature of the generic or cross-cutting learning in the university. We then have service and delivery and public debate. Sometimes public debate is, the public engagement, public debate role is collapsed into community engagement, but I think it's got quite a different flavor, so I'm going to separate it out. Service delivery here, we're looking for direct service. We're looking at direct services that universities provide to society, whether it's running particular projects or training, or there might be secondment of professionals to government or private sector and so forth. So these are direct links through which a service is provided. The public debate role is a much more diffuse but no less important role, and that relates to communication of research with the public, but also political actions of students and staff, campaigning, mobilization, or influencing of public debate in other ways, also providing a locus for public debate in some instances. So it's a very important role of universities, a very difficult one to research, and there's, I think of all of these, it's the area that we have the least evidence of. Those people who work in universities have personal experience and perhaps a common sense understanding of what the roles might be, but there's very little actual evidence of the kinds of impact that come through this. And the final one of these modalities is campus operations. So this is the actual running of the university itself. Its campus or campuses, and depending on what kind of institution we're talking about, of course, it manifests itself in all sorts of different ways. The over 20,000 higher education institutions in the world come in an unbelievably varied array of different forms and sizes. But universities have an impact through their communities. In some cases, they are towns or even small cities. I mean, there are universities with 500,000 students. And I'm not talking about online universities. I mean, there are distance universities with millions of students, particularly in the Indian subcontinent, but even face-to-face students, there are universities in Latin America with 500,000 students. So these are sizable communities and that have a very significant impact. And this is one of the ways in which universities can have a negative impact on climate change. And we're all aware Oren's already mentioned the question of investments of universities, a very, very important aspect. There's also carbon emissions through travel, staff travel, international student travel, and many other aspects of the university's work that we need to think about. So all of these elements are important to understand separately, but we also need to think about the interaction between these elements. So that's the arrow on the left-hand side of the screen. So how these influence one another, and we would hope for some kind of synergy between these different elements, at least hoping that they're not in tension with one another. But I'm afraid most of the time there are some kinds of tensions, and part of the reason for campaigns around changing the way campuses are run and investments and so forth is to try and avoid the hypocrisy between the kinds of public messages that universities are putting out and their actual actions in practice. So we need to think about the interaction. And finally, there's the impact of those activities on climate change in practice. And that takes us to the next of these graphics. So this is unpacking the impact of those 5 different modalities. So ultimately, we're interested in the impact of universities on climate itself and on temperature. And you know, it's of course the actual measurable impact on, you know, Celsius rise is almost impossible to detect, because the influences that go into actual temperature rises are so complex that you couldn't possibly detect an actual temperature rise that corresponds to all universities, let alone a particular university. So we have to work through the different cumulative effects that are in combination with other things that are happening in society, of course. And that happens through sometimes directly on the environment. So there are impacts of universities that are direct, for example, emissions from the campus or travel. So those are direct impacts through accumulation of greenhouse gases. But most of the impacts of universities are indirect, or they go through different layers. So through society as a whole, but particularly through what I call here bridging actors. So these are particular individuals or communities that have a close contact with universities. And the most obvious of these are, of course, students who then go out into society as graduates. And they go out into society having acquired a particular set of knowledge, skills, and values from the university that then influences their lives, both their professional work and their general lives, along, of course, with a whole range of other kinds of influences from their previous schooling, families and peers and so forth. There are also organizations and communities that come into direct contact with universities through outreach programs, through commissioning research, other kinds of involvement in the work of universities. And particularly in some countries, in some of the countries in Africa and Latin America and Asia in which we're working, there are many other kinds of direct relationships with communities and universities through use of facilities, all of which bring different kinds of impact. So we have effects on climate change moving from left to right of the screen. But of course, there are also feedback loops going the other way, which we won't be able to look at in depth. But clearly, climate also impacts on society. It impacts on universities. And as we see the cases of extreme weather and other kinds of impacts growing over coming decades, those may be more visible financial impacts as well that have a bearing on universities. So it is it is a system. It's not a one-way movement of influence. I'm sorry, this is actually quite hard to read, this one, but I won't expect you to really know what's going on here immediately. I will just highlight a couple of aspects here as examples. These lines are, it's a non-exhaustive list, but it highlights the most common pathways of impact. So the left-hand bubble there, the numbered and lettered ones are indicate the origin of the impact. So whether that's which of the modalities that's coming from, which of the bridging actors, if any, are engaged with, and then how that impacts on society and the ecosphere. So just to take some examples here, if we look at M1, we might be thinking of, for example, the impact of universities on engineers who receive their education in university, and then it will affect the kinds of design that they're bringing to whatever, whether they're working on buildings, bridges, that may be more or less environmentally friendly, with a corresponding impact on emissions and climate change. We might be dealing with public debate role of universities. So if we're thinking about M9, for example, we could be looking at the campaigning roles of lecturers, changing public opinion. The M1s relate to mitigation, so that's reducing or preventing the root causes of climate change. The A pathways here relate to adaptation, so that's changing lifestyles and communities so as to lessen the negative impacts of climate change. And here we can see some other roles of universities in, for example, working with community groups. If you think of A3, for example, working with community groups to change agricultural practices, perhaps. We've also got, you can see there, the M10 and A5 are through changes within the university. So seeing the university as its own entity, and the changes that come about within that are both beneficial for the university and for outside. An example of that might be tree planting on campus, for example, which both has a local benefit in terms of adaptation and might protect against flooding, but also has a longer term and broader positive impact in relation to absorption of carbon. So that's just a flavor of the different pathways that you can identify. So this isn't we could chart some others, but it's an indicative list that helps us to understand the most common pathways of influence. So this kind of frame can be helpful in research, in terms of identifying different activities that universities are undertaking, but also identifying the gaps in our knowledge. So if you go through these different pathways, there are some of these that have quite a lot of research. For example, professional education, research, some degree community engagement, and some that, as I said before, campus sustainability plans also has quite a lot of research, but very little on public engagement, as I mentioned. We could also use it as a normative frame for thinking about, as an institution, which of these areas have more emphasis, which areas have less, are they in synergy, or are there trade-offs between them? So having a descriptive, or having a normative role as well as potentially a role in orienting research. So to conclude then, we need to think beyond universities in their most obvious role, which is as producers of research on climate. I think that's the first thing that we think of when we think of universities and climate is production of research on changes in temperature and causes in climate change, to thinking about the whole host of other kinds of roles that universities play. And from there, thinking about the importance of higher education and quality of higher education in all contexts around the world, and with a view to transforming existing institutions, but also potentially with the creation of new institutions that can adapt themselves more wholeheartedly to the significant challenges. And we haven't delved much into the epistemic basis, but there are many people who argue that the roots of climate change go beyond some of these more surface elements into the very roots of our ontology and epistemology, our understanding of self and the way that we acquire and use knowledge about the world. And possibly the transformation of universities needs to go to that deeper level in actually creating a new basis for understanding of ourselves and the role of human beings in relation to the natural world, developing what Boaventura de Sousa Santos calls an ecology of knowledges, a pluralistic space where those different ways, and some which have a stronger degree of harmony between human beings and the natural world and between different peoples, can have a clearer space. So those are a few thoughts to set us off. Very much looking forward to your comments and questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tristan. I am opening the floor to any questions or comments. Jana, do you mind asking your question other than using the chat box?
Sure, absolutely. Hi, everybody. Good morning from Arizona. Tristan, thank you so much for the presentation. It reminded me of a paper I wrote in grad school about university leadership because of the previous administration's just, violence towards Muslim individuals and the ban that they put in place. And after that happened, I got emails from all the universities I had attended from their different presidents, and I did a discourse analysis of the tone that they were setting. And I found that our ASU president was kind of positioning himself as, on the same level as the president of the United States in terms of how he was phrasing his language. And the smaller universities I attended were in solidarity with the students. We defend you. And he was more like, this is wrong. So it made me think, as you were framing the different actors, the only one that's kind of individual actors in your map are graduates. And it made me wonder how you see university leadership, such as deans or universities as entities, but the leaders within them as part of this picture.
Thanks. That's a really great point. And yeah, I mean, there's no way that this framework tries to capture all of the important aspects in the way that universities function and what goes into them, sort of resources, governance, and everything else. We would need another frame to look at that. But absolutely, I mean, you've highlighted a really crucial point, and I think the literature more broadly on universities and sustainability highlights leadership as an absolutely crucial point. I think you mentioned Arizona State University. Was that one that you mentioned? I mean, it's usually held up as one of the sort of great successes of sustainability and neutral climate impact, or even positive climate impact, and actually. And leadership is often cited as one of the secrets of their success. So I was quite interested in your comment there. I think there's, I mean, it's quite hard to think about leadership without quite a lot of sensitivity to the strong differences between different countries and contexts in the way that higher education systems are and institutions are run. So I'd say the role of presidents or senior leadership, the relevance of that, it depends a lot on the autonomy that institutions have within the system. And for various reasons, many higher education institutions have very little autonomy, either because everything is decided for them by state regulation or funding streams, or because they're so deeply embedded in markets that there's actually very little leeway for discretion, because you're entirely dependent on your consumer funding base, as in the case of the growing for-profit sector. But clearly leadership has, in a broader sense, has some relevance everywhere. And I think what seems, I mean, one role for leadership is around coordination and linking up and synergy. So these are some of the buzzwords around sustainability that we need sort of joined up thinking and harmonization of all the disparate things that are happening across an institution. I think that's important, but I mean, maybe universities are inevitably going to be a bit higgledy-piggledy. I mean, the nature of the institution is that it's not the kind of rational institution where you can have absolute kind of uniformity and harmony. There's always going to be difference, and I think that's part of its value. So maybe the most important thing that leaders can do is not get in the way of the wonderful things that students are doing, the wonderful things that professors and lecturers are doing, and to provide spaces for people to realize those things. I mean, there's tremendous belief and action in relation to environment and climate change in universities all over the world. And the biggest obstacle is kind of lack of time or resource or competing activities. And I think if leaders can ease those spaces for people, that's probably the most positive thing that they can do.
Thank you, Jenna and Tristan. Others?
Hi, good morning, everyone. Tristan, thank you so much for your presentation. I'm Shreya. I live in New York right now, but I'm mainly from India. My quick question to you is, in your experience, having worked with universities and higher education institutions in developing countries, I've worked in India for a while, and I understand that most of their curriculum is so based on the job market. And a lot of students are always trained to just finish graduation and get jobs. So, and when I worked there as someone to bring up environmental programs, I realized it was so challenging, not so much with just the students, but with the management as well, which is why I completely understand Jenna's question as well, because it's so important to have leadership that backs these things up. So I just wanted to know, in your experience, what would be otherwise good practices to have climate education, not just within the curriculum, but maybe within extracurricular activities, for example, and if there's anything that you've come across in your own experience while working with such institutions.
Thanks very much for your question. Yeah, so that's really going to the heart of a very complex question around what universities should be teaching and their role in terms of the citizenry. I mean, universities are in a very difficult situation because they owe their extraordinary success of the last 50 years or so to the fact that employers of high-level jobs use the university degree as a proxy for various forms of skill and knowledge to be able to do a job. And with the exception of some large companies that do their own assessments, the university degree for professional, upper middle class jobs is absolutely essential to that. And that's led to an extraordinary increase in demand for university degrees and a reframing of the university as a professional training institution. Now, that's not to say that universities have ever been completely free of that. I mean, if we're, there are university traditions all the way all around the world of different types, but all of them that I know of, including the European university that's now dominant, have some clear links to work, even the very earliest forms of them, along with other things. So I think, what the university represents is a space for development of professional competencies, but alongside a range of other forms of learning that may not be directly linked with work, but are nevertheless crucial. We could divide those into, civic and personal forms of learning, and an experience of personal development, but importantly, a critical role as well in developing criticality. I think the change over time is one in which the certification role and the employability role of higher education has become stronger, but with the marketization of the university, even in public systems around the world, has led to a stronger economistic rationale for the university and an enhancement of the private returns. So more and more people are looking at university as a place where you invest in the enhancement of your own skills for an economic return in the labor market afterwards. And that, of course, makes life very hard for universities, because all forms of, even if you're not a for-profit university and you're directly in the market, you have to address to some degree the aims and aspirations of the students who are coming in. And for obvious reasons, young people all the way around the world, whatever background you're from, unless you are guaranteed a huge fortune on graduation, that means that you don't have to do anything at all. Most people depend on their degree for their subsequent work and well-being. Right. So it's impossible to completely avoid the employability dimensions, and clearly that's where most students are going to place the emphasis in terms of their studies, and that leads to a good deal of resistance when there are compulsory modules, for example, on climate change or environmental literacy or citizenship or something else. And quite a few universities have implemented these things. Probably you've done them yourselves, or you're familiar with them, or other kinds of cross-cutting units or modules. And some of them are fantastic, but there's quite often resistance from students. So they're not always very useful to, not always very easy to implement. So that's one side of the story, but there is another side of the story, which is that students do engage in other forms of learning, regardless of this kind of logic of the market. And that learning can be very, very significant, whether it's planned or not. I think you asked about some examples. I mean, I know a couple of really interesting examples, very successful examples in Ghana of universities, even in difficult conditions, that have managed to introduce a broader curriculum. One is a small private university, so it's well funded, so perhaps a little bit unusual in that regard, called Ashesi, that some of you may be familiar with. It was created on a liberal arts model, and they have a very broad interdisciplinary curriculum for all students that involves social studies, African studies, very strongly rooted in local cultures, as well as community volunteering, service learning, but then developing professional specialisms. So they're not sort of retreating from the employability thing altogether, but they are combining it with a very strong rooting in this social and environmental awareness. So that's a really successful model on a small scale. And it's true, they do have good funding, so they have good conditions. Another one is University for Development Studies in the north of Ghana, which is a public university. So they do face all the difficulties of a low resource level and so forth. And they have historically run what they call a third trimester program, where all students spend a few weeks in a local community every summer, working on development projects with the community. Whatever course they're doing at the university, you have to do this as a compulsory part of your course. And this has been a really fantastic experience in terms, well, I mean, there's brought some benefits to communities, but also for the learning of the students, this intercultural dialogue, having real world experience, understanding the issues that these rural communities are facing. So this kind of experiential learning is crucial. As of course our general experiences on campus. You know, we don't have much empirical research on this, but the learning that students gain through their experiences generally in the university community are absolutely crucial in this regard. Thanks for the question.
Thank you. That was helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, Tristan. Sean? But you're muted.
There, I was just saying negative stuff there. No, hi, Tristan, I liked your presentation. Your use of the word hypocrisy with respect to public statements and the internal actions of universities, the internal practices, really struck me. And I was wondering if you think this is driven by conscious decisions within the administrations, or if there's middle ground to help implement the model that you've laid out, described. And just to elaborate, pretty quickly, hypocrisy struck me as sort of has negative connotations to it. It's sort of and so I just was curious what your thoughts were on that.
Yeah, thanks. So, I mean, yeah, I think that's rather too strong, maybe, to use of university. I don't think. I think I wouldn't accuse individuals necessarily of hypocrisy, but I think in many cases, if you look at the institution as a whole, there might be a perception of hypocrisy between some things that universities do and other things that they do. And partly it's because it's a very diffuse institution. And it might be that many people don't know what a university endowment is invested in. Maybe you have to dig pretty deep to find out where the endowment is being invested. You might have to dig deep to find out what the procurement policy of an institution is, and whether some of the goods that are used by universities are actually leading to exploitation of communities in a distant part of the world, or environmental degradation. So universities are very complex institutions. So even with the best will in the world, there may be conflicting activities going on. And I think this is something that universities need to think very deeply about. And I think to be fair, universities all around the world have really been active in the recent years in trying to do this. I think there has been a change of attitude towards this, not in all cases, but certainly in some cases very, very actively. There's a new ranking that's been launched a couple of years ago. The Times Higher Education has an SDGs impact ranking, which rewards universities that have been contributing positively to the Sustainable Development Goals. So some universities might be motivated by this kind of thing to think more about what their impacts in different forms are, beyond just research excellence, elite publications, and so forth. So that might help. But the contradictory nature of institutions is perhaps a perennial thing for education. I mean, right. I did in an earlier part of my career, I did research around citizenship education, and it's another sort of paradigmatic case of institutions saying one thing and doing another. You're trying to form democratic citizens in often completely undemocratic ways. So yeah, it's a difficulty for education institutions.
Well, thanks. Thanks.
Yeah, go ahead, Charlie.
I do have a follow-up a little bit in that case with regard to the use of fossil fuels, which is, you know, there are some, and this may get a little bit detailed, which I apologize for, but you know, fossil fuels right now are required to integrate wind and solar into the grid as other solutions, technical solutions are being developed to facilitate that integration. So how do we reconcile and you know, that sort of that falls into that situation, I think, perhaps, where it's like we don't want to use fossil fuels, but yet in this case they appear to be necessary due to the nature of trying to achieve our overarching goal. How I don't know. I just how would you characterize that? And then I'll be quiet and leave it to others.
Well, I think there is a, you know, that there is a dilemma there for universities that don't have huge endowments. I mean, for universities that are very well off, maybe there's no excuse and they should use their power and leverage regardless of the cost. But if you are an institution on a very short budget in a low-income country, and it happens that conventional fossil fuel electricity is cheaper, it's going to be hard for you to make choices that might be more expensive because of the sort of absolute necessity. So this is a dilemma that countries as a whole face, it's a dilemma that institutions face. And I think, you know, there isn't a silver bullet to that. I think it needs to be a gradual shift that happens across whole societies and globally, as well as decisions that are taken within institutions. I think, you know, these things need to be happening hand in hand.
Any other questions?
I guess I just have one more comment. I've been reflecting on your map, Tristan, and I'm thinking about what universities do and how that can be divided into different actions. So one is the actual consumption of the university buildings and campus, but another is the education that happens within those buildings. And something that I think Arizona State does really well is to be interdisciplinary. And I think something that Columbia does really well is to communicate to the world the importance of these topics, you know, with the institutes that they're developing and the projects that they're doing, and things like what Oren's doing with these, our ability to get together and talk on a regular basis across universities. So it made me think about just that interdisciplinarity and what that might mean for even a smaller university in a different location than the United States that I've referenced. What do you think about that, about interdisciplinarity?
Thanks. Yeah, so it's a really crucial topic. So there are different kinds of definitions, but the one that makes sense to me is to think of multidisciplinary in terms of, you know, engaging lots of different disciplines, but in a way that they remain separate. Interdisciplinary when there's a kind of a dialogue between those disciplines, and then transdisciplinary when you go beyond disciplines altogether. So you create knowledge beyond the boundaries of disciplines. And it strikes me that for climate change, you absolutely cannot avoid being multidisciplinary. I mean, it would just be ludicrous to suggest anything else, because unless you actually don't believe in anthropogenic climate change at all, unless you think that there is no relationship between human beings' actions and society and climate change, you have to engage different disciplines, because it can't possibly just be a question of you know, natural sciences or so multidisciplinary work is inevitable. Whether we move towards interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary work, well, that's a rather more complex issue. I mean, most of the writing on this argues for it, that there's a positive benefit from interdisciplinary work, because if you can bring, you know, different kinds of scientists, social scientists, people from arts and humanities together, that they can and they can influence each other's work in positive ways. And particularly given the fact that climate is a complex system, many people argue that our conventional disciplines, in that working in, sort of, to use a buzzword, in silos, can't actually crack the code. You know, the problem can't be solved because it's such a complex issue, a wicked problem, as it's sometimes called. So we need this dialogue between disciplines in order to think in different ways about it through interaction between disciplines. Transdisciplinary thinking is a different matter, and I think that's, the word might be used quite a lot, but I think it's very rarely exercised. And I think then we are going to quite an exciting but a very different and perhaps a scary place that most people in Western academia probably find very unfamiliar, and that's not having a rooting in a discipline at all, or at least uprooting it and moving around in a more fluid way. Perhaps in educational research, we're more comfortable with that than most people, because education is at the very least a multidisciplinary, if not an interdisciplinary field. But for many people in academia, it's deeply unsettling to let go of one's discipline, because it provides identity. It's all bound up in career incentives and publication and every aspect of one's work, and in fact the whole legitimacy of everything one does in terms of research and teaching. So it's a very uncomfortable space for people. But if you believe that there is something about contemporary capitalist society which has made climate change possible or inevitable, perhaps we do need to go to that level and think much more deeply about the basis of our knowledge, and that in that sense transdisciplinary work might be the solution.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Jana and Tristan. Carla, would you like to bring your question to ask it?
Thank you very much, Oren. Thank you, Tristan. I really enjoyed your presentation. Coming from a low-income country with a long-standing history of social inequality and structural issues such as poverty, very unequal access to university education, a very small percentage of the population actually making it to education. I'm concerned that it's rather difficult to get the message across that climate change should be interdisciplinary addressed, and cross-cuttingly and by means of holistic approaches such as the ones you've been reviewing and sharing with us. So I wonder if there's any hint that you could throw this way regarding how to help universities become aware of the fact that addressing poverty and all these social structural issues is not a mutually exclusive task with addressing climate change. Yeah. I don't know if my question is too muddy. But...
Yeah, thanks. That's a really crucial point, because it's not just about having a university that engages with the world outside it and that has an egalitarian orientation or a developmental one, or is concerned and engaged with communities. I think it's true that in some cases poverty might be such a pressing issue, particularly extreme poverty, that it is entirely appropriate for that to be a priority for a university, if indeed the university really can and is doing something about that, which is quite hard for universities to do in a direct way. But I think that there is the whole notion of sustainable development, for all of its difficulties and faults, does try to do that. I mean, it tries to see a kind of a synergy between human well-being, global social justice, and environmental protection and well-being. So that's the aim of the idea of sustainable development. But I think there is a kind of, there is a sense amongst some, socially conscious university people that environment is a bit of a middle class concern. You know, that it's, you know, and I've had someone, you know, questioning me in a recent session about the fact that Greta Thunberg comes from a privileged family, so why should we listen to her, you know? And I think this is, I mean, I can understand where that's coming from, and I think it might, you know, there's a sort of romanticization of nature in urban middle class communities that you know, so I can see where the resistance comes from, but it is, you know, looking at questions of poverty in isolation from the natural environment, of course, are never really going to solve the problem, because while it might be possible for us to get cheap goods now that might provide basic necessities to families, if those very cheap goods are destroying the natural environment, then in the medium term, let alone the long term, they're going to create more problems for the poorest communities. And as we can see, you know, on a week by week basis, the communities that are most affected by different kinds of impact, whether it's extreme weather or pests affecting agriculture or various other kinds of impacts, the poorest communities are the most vulnerable to. So there is a real interest, you know, of those communities in questions of natural environment as well as material poverty. And in fact, many of the poorest communities in the world are themselves mobilizing to protect natural environments in a way that is very synergistic with their needs for livelihood and sustenance and so forth.
Great. Thank you, Tristan, and thank you everybody for participating today. I think we got many interesting ideas on the different elements of higher education institutions and how we, as part of these institutions, are affecting and contributing to climate change and what we can do to mitigate and adapt to it. I personally am leaving the conversation with Tristan and you all today thinking about the different research projects that one can develop on this topic itself. Basically thinking about how the different factors of what we do in higher education, how they shape the public legitimacy that higher education institutions have when we enter the debate on climate change. So I think that by changing the way we behave as an institution, we are modeling that we are actually walking the talk. And that's actually important if we want to enter the discussion. So thank you, Tristan, for the paper, and thank you for all your work and for your presentation today. And everybody else, please follow us on Twitter or the website in order to learn on more activities and sessions on climate and sustainability throughout the year. Thank you, everybody. Have a good day.
Thanks a lot for all your questions.